Hey everybody, good to be with you again for our next session. And so here we are focusing on the theme of wilderness, and our lesson comes from the end of Acts 22 through most of Acts chapter 23. And this is the time when Paul is actually in Jerusalem, and he is seized first by Jews, then rescued momentarily by Romans who seem to have a case of mistaken identity here and think that he is some Egyptian who was trying to lead a rebellion some years ago. But Paul clears that up very quickly and then wants to speak to the people, and we see a plot being hatched over the course of Paul's arrest for the sake of his own safety by the Romans, and then how he is whisked off to Caesarea in the middle of the night to try to avoid being assassinated. So I'm titling this lesson, Yahweh's Promise to Abide Quells All Danger. Remember, as we've done this with every single quarter, this theme of wilderness, i.e., the liminal space between going back to the Old Testament story of Israel leaving Egypt and are in the wilderness until they come to Sinai. But of course, they're still there, but they are not really required to do a whole awful lot. They're just encamped by a mountain. But then they have to embark upon another phase of the wilderness journey until they get to Canaan. And that journey stretches on beyond a few months to now 40 years. So in this liminal space, God is testing them, and they must learn to trust him and rely on him for everything and not their own ingenuity or anything of that regard, or anyone else to help them, but the fact that Yahweh is for them as long as they are for him. Even when they're not for him, he is still faithful. So in this middle block here, I just want to point out the fact that Paul is a symbolically renewed Israel throughout this entire movement of the book of Acts. We should see him as such. He is the promised faithful remnant of Israel. The sum total of it doesn't rest on his shoulders. I'm just saying he is a cross section of that, a symbolic picture of it, and that he will reach the quote promised land that Yahweh spoke of if he will simply trust himself to Yahweh's will. The promised land is not the geographical boundaries of Israel Old Testament sense, but the inheritance that's promised to Abraham from the beginning, and that is the world. But this promised land that Paul is meant to go to, of course, is to testify in front of kings and governors and various other people. And of course, he will do that very shortly, and even as part of the upcoming narrative that we'll get to after this lesson. But the point I want to make is the promised land and that inheritance is something that Paul is striving all to get all believers to recognize is part of their inheritance. And so as he is striving for it, as he tells them in Antioch of Pisidia, you must go through many hardships to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He himself is leading the charge and by example of that. So what I'm doing here on both sides of the screen is actually illustrating from a story of Israel in the wilderness in the Old Testament, in the summary of what's going on with Balak, the king of Moab, who hires Balaam, son of Peor, to try to curse them and allow a scenario or create a scenario in which Yahweh is underimpressed and disappointed with Israel and actually will turn them over into Balak's hands to allow Balak to annihilate them and then preserve his own people, is something a little akin to what's going on here with Paul, who is going through his own little wilderness journey because he come to Jerusalem, but now he's been ousted. And he is waiting now for what will eventually be years before he winds up making it to Rome to testify in front of Nero or the emperor there. So I'm not going to read all of these passages. I just want to point out a few things, and I'll unpack it later on when I actually get a chance to unfold this more on our Wednesday night little chat. So upper left corner, Israel in the wilderness, Balak and Balaam attack. And this is what Balak is summoning Balaam for. He says to Balaam, look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the surface of the land. They and are living right across from me. Please come and put a curse on these people for me because they are more powerful than I am. Again, the idea is that this curse will allow them to be weakened in their relationship with their God. And by virtue of that, their God would be okay with them being punished or even outright obliterated by the hand of Balak. So the same thing is going on here with Paul. Paul in the wilderness between Jerusalem now and Caesarea. He's still in Jerusalem, of course, when this attack is launched, but the wilderness phase will stretch onto Caesarea and then across the Mediterranean Sea until eventually he lands in Rome itself. And so here, some Jews from the province of Asia saw him in the temple, and they're shouting, fellow Israelites, help this man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. What's more is he has brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this place. So they're screaming for help because they want these people to assist him and rounding him up and essentially stoning him to death. If they have their way, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to put Paul to death, and they actually scream for his death to be executed that very moment, much in the same way that the bloodthirsty crowds were demanding of Pilate that Jesus be crucified by virtue of their desire or their whims. So anyway, we continue to move forward with, on the left side of the screen, Balak wants nothing more than Israel's annihilation. And of course, the same thing is said of Paul. When Balak comes to Balaam, he says, now come, put a curse on them that I may be able to fight against them and to drive them away. But of course, driving them away isn't going to be enough. He wants to severely weaken them and leave them with little more than just women and children left who can be bought and sold and bartered as slaves. We go to the Acts narrative, and then they raise their voices, shouting, wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live. So we could go on in this as far as reading each of these passages, but I'm just going to sum up the purple blocks here. So Balak is sacrificing animals to coax Yahweh to hear him, which ironically enough, this is what's going on over here in the Acts narrative, not because these people are sacrificing for the sake of trying to get Yahweh to loosen his grip of protection on Paul. They just happen to notice incidentally that Paul's there. But these Jews are there in the temple, presumably to offer sacrifices. So we have a templeless background operative here in the story of Balaam, and the Israelites, even though the Israelites are completely unaware of what's going on here. But we also have the same thing going on over in the book of Acts when they are literally in the temple. And sacrifices are being made in the background when all of this kerfuffle kicks up. So back to the left side, the plot is hatched. Balaam will weaken Israel for Balak. So, of course, the four oracles that he gives are all blessings upon Israel, but it doesn't end there. We go to Joshua, and we clearly understand from both the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, in conjunction with Joshua, that Balaam played his part in the end, that even though he could not say anything negative against Israel, he seduced Israel by luring them into cultic sacrifices with the Moabites and Midianites. And by virtue of that, God was disappointed in them, and he brought plague into the midst of the camp. Thousands died until Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, actually stood up and did what he did to stop it. So over to the right side of the screen, the plot is hatched. The Jews vow to Yahweh to fast and to kill Paul. So ultimately, they set themselves aside for the sake of doing this very thing. They will not touch food or water until Paul's blood is firmly upon their hands. So in both senses, or in both cases, even though it's not a point for point as goes how the plot was hatched, it's just the fact that a plot was indeed hatched and was about to be executed, because no doubt these men were lying in wait had it not been for the fact that Paul was not going to leave the next day during the daylight. Instead, he was whisked out of there with a very heavy armed guard on his way to Caesarea. And it didn't stop there, because remember, when the governor Felix was replaced with Porcius Festus, Festus actually offered Paul the chance to go back to Jerusalem and to be tried there. But that's because the Jews were lying in wait to ambush him on his way back. And this was 2 years after the fact. So then lastly, by the mouth of a Gentile, Israel is protected, that being through the oracle blessings of Balaam. And by the hand of a Gentile, Paul is protected by virtue of the centurion who listened to Paul, recognized he was a Roman citizen, and then afforded him the opportunity to then go under heavy armed guard to Caesarea, where he would then stand trial for what he was being accused of, but in safety. So I hope that's helpful and insightful in some way. I would encourage you to continue to seek out these parallels here, but all for the sake of recognizing that as Paul trusted Yahweh in all that was going on here, even though he didn't have the full plan, he just knew that he was going to be God's instrument. If Ananias truly told him the very words that Jesus said to him, which we don't have record of that, but if he did convey that message, Paul knew that this was going to unfold over the course of his walk. So no doubt he has a measure of faith, but he must also trust, though he doesn't know all the variables, that God is going to bring to pass what he said he would, which probably is what gave Paul part of the confidence he had in appealing to Caesar, knowing full well that even though he gets the chance to testify perhaps in front of this Roman governor who's there at the time, and maybe even the king over the Jews, that being Herod Agrippa, that he is still perhaps going to go beyond that, for as long as God has use for him, nothing is going to happen to him. Nothing and no one will touch him unless God says it's to be so. So that's an example that any and every one of us should aspire to continue to emulate. So tune in for the next one.